Prospect House Media.
And now, prepare yourself for the only weekly podcast you won't want to miss. Welcome to the Ameritocracy Show with Troy Edgar, live from our studios in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C.
Hey everybody, I am Troy Edgar and welcome to the Ameritocracy Show. Thank you for tuning in and checking it out. It is greatly appreciated. This podcast examines the conditions for personal and professional growth and opportunity across America. This week on Ameritocracy, I'm joined in Washington, D.C. by Irv Dennis, the former Chief Financial Officer of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. During his time at HUD, Irv served as the Secretary's top financial advisor and managed the department's $48 billion budget. He is also the author of Transforming a Federal Agency, where he shares his experience in leading comprehensive financial and digital overhaul that resulted in HUD's first clean audit opinion in over 8 years. Having served as CFOs leading billion-dollar federal agencies, Irv and I discuss our journeys from the private sector into government, our Senate confirmation process, and the shared commitment to government modernization. One key takeaway from our conversation is the critical role of transparency, compliance, and effective leadership in achieving lasting change for the betterment of the American people. I hope you enjoy. Good afternoon, Irv. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to do this.
It's so good to connect with you.
Yes.
Yeah, I know you go back between here, sometimes Florida, back and forth, and it's good to have you in town.
Yeah, thank you. My real home is in Columbus, Ohio, so I spent some time in Florida to vacation a little bit, but we have a place down there, so we're down there in the wintertime, but between here and Columbus is most of the route. Yeah.
So, Irv, you and I worked together the last administration, and it was a great experience. And a lot of people have heard me talk about my experience as being the CFO for DHS, but as you being the CFO for HUD, by the time I got in, you had been here for probably about a year and a half before me. And a lot of people that I would talk to, I said, hey, let me get in and network with the people that are actually CFOs and that have come in through the political side and see how they're adapting. And everybody says, you got to talk to Irv. Yeah. And so you were a great mentor to a lot of us CFOs that came in. And so I just want to start off by saying
thank you. It's nice of you to say.
Yeah. And, when we got together, we started kind of comparing notes and trying to kind of get really the most out of this experience to be able to have the honor to serve our nation. I thought it was really helpful to have someone to be able to talk to and to figure out, I think the thing where you and I had a common ground is you came at this as a partner from Ernst & Young after many years. And what I thought would be helpful for the listeners just in the beginning here is if you wouldn't mind just giving an overview of your background that kind of got you ready, and then we'll talk about how we came into the government.
Yeah, well, thank you, Troy. And again, thank you for having me. How I found my way to public service in the executive branch was very unique, unexpected. As you mentioned, I spent close to 38 years with Ernst & Young, and I was in the commercial sector. I was an auditor. I'm a CPA by trade, and spent my entire career with Ernst & Young, and it was a great career. I worked on a lot of large accounts. I was the audit partner on large global names you'd recognize: McDonald's, Abbott Labs, Cardinal Health, et cetera. And with all the large accounting firms, we have a mandatory retirement age, and I was hitting that in 2017. And I grew up with humble beginnings, and my goal in retirement was to give back and do meaningful work. And I was going to teach at Ohio State. I had a contract.
Glad you avoided that as a USC guy.
Very good. And I worked in 6 different offices with Ernst & Young and found my way to Columbus. And we ended up retiring there. I have a son and daughter and grandchildren, so that's where we spend most of our time. And so I had a contract with OSU. I had 4 syllabuses done. I had 4 classes I was going to teach. And I got a unique call from the White House to see if I'd be interested in coming into the executive branch to be the CFO at HUD with Secretary Carson. I was not interested, but I was intrigued by the request. I was sitting in my office in Columbus and got an email followed by a phone call. And I took the initial interview and I flew to DC here. I met with the chief of staff and the chief operating officer and the deputy chief of staff. Had a great conversation. HUD's financials were a mess, and I'm sure we'll end up talking about that. We had a great interview. I had a vision for how to fix it. We spent a lot of time talking about HUD's financial situation. Secretary happened to be in that day, so I went over, spent some time with him. I left the office from the secretary's office, and the chief of staff said, "Hey, head over to the White House because we're going to offer you the job." And I said, "Well, this is going awfully fast."
Right.
So I said, "I've got a plane to catch, but let me think about it tonight." I called the next day. I flew home to Columbus, called the next day and declined. I said, I'm just retired, running 130 miles an hour for 38 years. I don't think I want to do something that full time. So I declined.
Wow.
They kept calling every Friday afternoon for about 2.5 months. And the story was they had about 250 resumes. They had 25 on-site interviews, and they just really liked my style, my vision, and that we clicked with the personalities. So after about 2.5 months, my wife said, every time they call, your juices flow, and you're never going to have this opportunity again. So I called the dean at Ohio State and said, I have this opportunity. He goes, "Yeah, you mentioned that, and you're crazy not to take it." He said, "You can come back here and teach anytime, with the private public sector experience. That'll be very valuable to students." So I called the secretary and the chief of staff, I should say, and said, "I'm going to do it." And the secretary called me about a half hour later and thanked me, and that started the process. So wow. I had no knowledge of Washington, no knowledge of government, no knowledge of how any of this world works. But I felt I was up to the challenge.
So, Irv, just to kind of explore this a little bit, because you and I probably had a very similar experience when you get that call. It's kind of hard because you feel the weight of the public service. Like, your whole career, you actually have something to give back, and it feels really, really good. I know for me, I owned a bunch of companies and it was a pretty big financial step back to be able to say, hey, and plus I had clients that, I was doing a major reorganization for Toyota in Plano, Texas. And I really kind of like you was sitting back going, And I had stumbled on this, and I've had this discussion over drinks, but I was able to meet with the president through a process, being the mayor of a city in California. So I didn't really, this was a part-time job. I was just giving back in my community. Absolutely. Like and just happened to be able to meet with the president and that process of anybody that, they meet with, they know more about you than you think they do. Yes. And they're like, hey, you really should think about a higher level of public service. I'm like, well, that's about all I have time for. But a question for you, when you went through that process and you gave the go ahead, it is kind of interesting because I think, presidential appointees, Senate confirmed. Yeah. And so you and I both been through that similar process. And when the position is announced, the president, the White House actually announces it, and then you kind of start that process to go through the confirmation. And for CFOs, they're usually a privileged confirmation, which means that if they, if there's no controversy, you have to go through the process and the vetting, and everything, and you're submitted. The package is submitted to the Senate. If there's no objections, they get like 10 days to be able to action. If not, then you're on the Senate calendar and you can just be voice voted across. Yeah. And was that your experience? Because I know mine was totally different.
Yes, it was. Once I said yes, then the next step was go to the White House Personnel Office, and they have your dossier. They sit there and review it. The president has the opportunity to meet you if he wants, and they didn't. Coming from my background as a partner with the Big Four firms, we come with a pretty clean slate. We go through a lot of background checks with the firm and stuff. So we don't have a lot of baggage, if any. So once I said yes, I did not realize how daunting the process went from there.
Yeah.
And there were forms to fill out, and there were more forms to fill out. And it starts with initial background by the FBI.
Yep.
And it took me 90 hours to fill out the forms. It was daunting. And I do a lot of guest lecturing with students. And I say, if you ever have an aspiration to have a public service in a Senate confirmed position, keep yourself clean from 18 on, because they took me back to when I was 18 years old. It's very invasive from a personal standpoint and a financial standpoint. I had to fill out all my living addresses, of which I had about 12. I had to give references at each of those living addresses. I had to give references to 4 college friends. So for 12 locations, references for 4 for each. That took a while just to dig that up. They want all of your financial information.
That's right.
And that's very daunting too. I'm retired. This wasn't about economics for me. This was about giving back and doing meaningful work. So financial records are very invasive. We also have to fill all of our international travel. And that's where it got a little tricky for me, because we only had to go back 12 years. But in that 12 years, I had 90 submissions. Wow. And they wanted to know where you stayed, where you went, and who you met with. And luckily, Ernst & Young, we had records that took me back 10 years with American Express, but then I had to go back to my passport and fill all that out. So that was that. Once I spent those 90 hours, submitted it, I didn't hear anything for a while, like maybe 6 or 7 weeks. And I'm fast-tracked. They told me I was fast-tracked because they wanted me to get in there and get started. Then I had the FBI investigation. And so we went into, it was held in Columbus, and we went into a small room, 6 by 6, all white walls. Yeah. And I write about this in my book because I thought it was fascinating. That was about an 1.5 to 2 hour interview. And he was very, very focused on all of my international travel. We spent 45 minutes. What'd you do here? What'd you do here? What public officials did you meet? And of course, they don't want you to be beholden to anyone. So it all makes sense, but it was relatively daunting. That took 2 months. And then once that process, then you go into the process of meeting with staffers up on the Hill. And I met with all 4 corner staffers. And what I found with that was, I found that interesting because you really got a perspective of what they were interested in you doing for the agency and for the public. And it was all about financial and fiscal responsibility at HUD because the financials were a mess and a lot of internal controls. IT was very antiquated. And as you and I have chatted before, President Trump wanted business minds inside the government to help with IT modernization and to help with financial discipline. And so he tried to get as many business people in as he can in the right positions. So once that process started, as you say, it was a privilege. So I did not have to go through a hearing at that point. But that took probably another 6 weeks to go through that process. And I was finally confirmed and sworn in in January.
Can I ask you a question? When you were meeting with the senators going through, I found that fascinating.
I did too.
Being at DHS, you're not going to get a free pass. Yes. And they pulled the privilege nomination. So they actually pulled me into having a Senate confirmation hearing.
Oh, did they? No.
And, but I thought what was interesting, both sides of the aisle meet with you.
Yes.
And one of the, I had really great discussions with all the senators. Yes. But one of the best discussions I had was with Senator Jackie Rosen from Nevada. Come to find out, she actually grew up. We have a racetrack where I was the mayor, and she was like, "Troy, I used to be a waitress at a restaurant right across the street." Yeah. The nicest lady, right? And then I ended up, for my Senate confirmation, going up with Chad Wolf. We were both up for our hearings together, and we passed through the hearing, and then she basically pulled our nominations and basically didn't let me pass for 6 months.
Oh, wow.
And so it's like, nothing personal. That's what they say, but it's, you realize that you're kind of a piece on the table.
Yeah, you're a pawn on the in many ways. It's the political games that go on was very fascinating just to learn. And it was never about you personally. They wanted you in that position. Yeah. but they wanted something else over here, and they just wait for the decision making to go and the gamesmanship to start.
Yeah. And once you had the confirmation, so had you really stepped in to the building at all before your confirmation?
I actually, so when I said yes in July. President nominated me about 3 or 4 weeks later. That was formally announced. I offered to come and get started. Mm-hmm. I mean, this was not about economics for me. I said, I'm happy to come down. I don't need to get paid. I just want to learn and get started. There's a big task in front of us. And I guess that's illegal. You're not allowed to do that.
Yeah.
And they also said, we don't want to get you too educated in case you do get a hearing, because you're better off not knowing than trying to answer questions in that process. So it started, okay, this is interesting. Mm-hmm. I had to hold off until I got confirmed to get started. But I was excited to get started. You asked a little bit about the importance of the position. I didn't recognize the weight of it right away. I was excited to do it. It certainly was meaningful work, and it hit the qualification of doing meaningful work and giving back, right? Because as you said, this is the economics of this are quite different than what you're used to in our positions in the business world. But I got sworn in on January 5th. I brought my family down. And my son and I were sitting in my office that was designated for me when I get started. And then I just felt the weight of it. Mm-hmm. I said, this is a bigger deal than what I was thinking of. Right. And you go through the process of getting sworn in, and the secretary swore us in. There was 3 of us at the same time. Mm-hmm. Then I felt energized but extraordinarily humbled. Mm-hmm. And just my parents had passed a long time ago, but just knowing how proud of me they would have been at that time going through that. But the time I said yes to the time I got confirmed, I spent maybe 7 or 8 days in the office, and it was really just to meet with the people that were going to be reporting to me, people I'd be working with, and then the Office of Legislation Affairs prepped me for the meetings with the senators and their staff. So very little time in the office. I didn't really know what I was getting into after I was sworn in.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah. I like you, family came out. Yeah. A little bit different though is I had my Senate confirmation hearing and went through that process and was voted favorably, but then been held. I ended up going to the White House, and they're like, Troy, why don't you come in before? So they put me in as the deputy undersecretary of management.
So they had a position for
yeah.
you.
So I actually came in it was funny is they said, we would like you to come in. We really need business help at DHS. And I'm like, okay, let's do this. But before we do it, we need to check with the senators to make sure, as a professional courtesy. Yeah. And I always thought it was interesting as they let me come in as the associate deputy under secretary of management, which is really the person in charge of the CFO.
Right.
But that job was not filled, still not filled in the undersecretary of management job. And there was this, Troy, feel free, definitely do this, but don't take on the financial systems modernization. Yeah. Be careful. We don't want you to be going and testifying for the finances at this point. Just be careful. Yeah. And I had an opportunity to kind of come in. But like you said, that ability, and I don't know about you, but you and I have the same background where being in, I was consulting, you're in audit. Yeah. We're used to kind of coming in the front door, especially the big days when I was at PricewaterhouseCoopers and Pricewaterhouse before that, and you at EY, you're dealing with the CFO of a Fortune 500 company, sometimes the CEO, sometimes interested members of the board. And I got a rush out of that, but so you're dealing at the top, but when you kind of switch this around, you are that guy. Yes. And you're the person that you realize like time is precious. Yes. And you could spend a ton of time making decisions on 100 things or 3 big ones. Yes. And so did you find that adjustment a little bit after being an audit partner to be able to kind of adjust into leading a pretty large organization?
For me, it was, it was a brand new world. Like I said, I didn't know anything about government. I was not involved in politics at all. I didn't know Washington. I did commercial stuff, like I mentioned, McDonald's. And I knew big, I knew global, I knew complex, and I knew financial excellence in that environment. And that's what was needed at HUD. They're large, very, very complex, and also in need of a lot of financial discipline. I did not get overwhelmed by the spirit of that, Lo. I approached this very similar to taking on a brand new large client. And as an audit partner, you only can sign an opinion for 5 years. It's a requirement by the SEC for independence reasons. So every 5 years, I was moving from one large company to another in the audit partner role, the coordinating partner role. So I had responsibilities for. My accounts had 700 people sitting in 100 different countries around the world. So, I was used to that large, complex coordination. So I approached it in a very similar way. I came in and I should also step back. I recognized I was unique from a lot of politicals. A lot of political appointees are there for a reason other than to execute. A lot of them it's a resume build. They may run for office. They want to build a Washington monument somewhere. They have bigger aspirations. This is a resume build to do something, which is fine. I mean, I get the importance of that. For me, I was doing it to keep myself busy and to give back and do meaningful work. And before I took the position, I had this conversation with the Secretary of Staff. I said, you need to understand my terms of saying yes. One is if someone asks me to do something wrong, I'm leaving the next day, if not that day. I was not in a position where I wanted to be. I didn't have any skeletons in the past. I wanted to keep it that way. And secondly, if I really didn't enjoy it, we're talking 6 months to a year. And the message back from everyone was, no one's going to ask to do anything wrong, and they didn't. And the message was, you're going to really enjoy it because this is a different calling than the private sector work. You're working for the American people trying to make a difference. And they were absolutely right about that. So how I approached this was I needed to learn the business. I didn't know anything about HUD, so I had to learn their programming. So I had to learn their financial statement close process and how HUD does its business, how funds flow. I needed to develop relationships. And again, this is exactly how I did it with large accounts. Learn the business, develop relationships. In the private sector, you're developing relationships with the board, the C-suite, the CEO, CFO, as well as the lower level management, because they're the ones that you can get a lot of information from. So I needed to develop relationships at HUD with the HUD politicals, the HUD careers, and also equally as important with interagency government agencies that were important to HUD, Treasury, GAO, the IG, the Hill, OMB, all those government agencies impact what I was trying to accomplish. So I spent a lot of time nurturing those relationships in the first 6 months. And then the ultimate is to evaluate people, process, and technology. And when you have a financial disarray as HUD, there's likely to be issues of remediation needs in each of those, people, process, and technology. What I didn't realize was how much remediation was needed in all three of those categories.
Right.
And so then it was game on. I was getting energized. I was told by 3 high-level people that I was wasting my time. We were never going to fix HUD because they had issues back to the 1980s. They hadn't had a clean audit opinion in close to 10 years. They did not have a CFO for 8 years, and they had 13 or 14 material weaknesses, all kinds of significant deficiencies. And my objective, clear to everyone that I talked to through the confirmation process, was to fix that. Modernize the IT, get rid of the material weaknesses, get it to state of audit readiness. But you probably won't be successful. Do the best you can. So that was my challenge. I approached this just like I did any large client. So I wasn't overwhelmed with the newness of any of that. What I was very conscious of was had a very strong deputy CFO who was a career staff and a very, very good guy. And when I met him, I said, George, you're going to be one of the key to...
George Tomachek.
George Tomachek. Yeah, you know George.
He's a great guy.
Great guy.
Awesome.
And I said, George, I've got a great vision here to how to fix this. I've got a vision how to lead people through that. I don't know Washington. And I need you to make sure that I walk around Washington without stepping on landmines. And you know how easy that is to do.
Oh, yeah.
And he was brilliant at that. And if it wasn't for him, I don't know that we would have been as successful as we were, because I would have messed something up somewhere in some communication, said something wrong. And you know the difference between private and public. You can be a little more candid in the private sector.
That's right.
In the public sector, it's a little more tricky in the communication styles. But I had a strong staff, and George was very strong and very helpful to me to accomplish what I wanted to accomplish.
Irv, talk a little bit about the construct of HUD. So you and I talk a lot outside of this, DHS, 23 components, headquarters, a lot of stuff going on. HUD, what's the basic structure, the budget, et cetera?
So the budget when I got there is like, as it relates to the program in housing, HUD's responsibilities in simple terms is to provide safe and affordable housing for those in need, or those in the lower rung of the economic ladder. And they had $48 billion of, I would say, housing subsidies for those in need. They also support housing through FHA, providing mortgage guarantees and mortgage processing, and they provide the liquidity through Ginnie Mae. And all three of those, are geared towards helping the underprivileged and getting affordable and safe housing. The HUD had about a $1.3 trillion portfolio at the time, and Ginnie Mae had about $1 trillion portfolio. So it was large, it was complex. When it came to the monies for the subsidized housing, there's about 40 different programs, and the programs were allocated amongst 4 different program offices, I would say. So 40 different grant programs, and it's governed by about 8 different program offices. What I found was very dissimilar to the private sector. Each one of those entities, FHA, Ginnie Mae, and each of the 8 programs operated in a silo. They were doing their own IT, their own business processes, their own communication with grantees. And I recognized right away HUD needed a new governance structure. Now, when I talk about the material weakness in the CFO office, I said to our staff right away, this office is getting blamed for all the financial material weaknesses, but this isn't the office's fault. It's out in the programs. My experience said to me that 95% of these issues are out in the programs. What we didn't have at HUD was a governance structure where all the programs are working together cohesively with a one HUD mentality under the same business processes throughout the agency. So I said to the secretary in my second week, when I met with him, he uses this story all the time. I said, Secretary Carson, if I did a lot of client continuance and acceptance at Ernst & Young as an audit partner, we never would have taken this entity on as a client. There's just too much risk when you're auditing an agency that has so many material weaknesses and you can't perform an audit. I said, what we need is a new governance structure. We need everyone working together on a one HUD mentality, have constant policies and procedures throughout, and a common understanding of what good financial discipline is through internal controls. So we set up a governing structure. We branded it the Agency-Wide Integrity Task Force, and it was a group of each of the key programs: FHA, Ginnie Mae, CFO office, CIO, general counsel. And we started meeting once a week, talking about the issues at HUD and what we were trying to fix, and then getting together a common understanding of all that. We let it out of the CFO office, but we had everyone engaged in it. And we just didn't have politicals on that structure. The committee was made up of a political and the top career person, because we needed that to be sustainable, and we needed everyone educated on it. So once we put that governance structure in, we started to think differently about the financial discipline, the financial controls, how money flows, how working with the grantees can be done, or should be done a little bit different with a little more discipline. And the goal was to create efficient and effective flow of funds without the fraud, waste, and abuse that was happening in the past. We were getting terrible reports. We were in compliance with nothing. Data Act. I won't bore your audience with the definition of a data act. I won't bore your audience with the definition of material weakness. But and you're not in compliance with all of these things. The federal government has multiple avenues for reporting the accountability of funds to the public. The Data Act, the Gone Act, all these things. We were in compliance with none of them. There wasn't one thing we were in compliance with. So I created a report that created that transparency. Then we said, this is how we're going to fix this. And even people at HUD were surprised. When I created that transparency, this is what you're supposed to do. We don't comply with any of it. There was it was an awakening. So, that was kind of the start of the education process to get everyone thinking, why aren't we in compliance with that? We had no credibility with OMB. We had no credibility on the Hill. We had no credibility with General Accountability Office and the Treasury. And they're the relationships I nurtured because I wanted them to know we were taking this serious. And so the governance structure was really important for us to get down.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
So you said a couple of things. You hadn't had a CFO for 8 years. Yes. You're a political person kind of coming in, but you're, a Big Four audit partner. Yeah. So you've seen the best of the best in the commercial world. Some of the work that I've been focused on outside of my normal 9-to-5 job is policy work on Senate confirmations and whether CFOs should be confirmed. And the CFO Act, passed 1990, basically set up the 24 statutory CFO organizations, and those, at least 14 of them are Senate confirmed. And I guess the question I have for you is, like, with all the problems to get people through Senate confirmation, I think our stories would be a little bit polar opposite. You can see why those jobs remain open. And at any given time, you could see that probably half the CFO jobs aren't filled. And I would say, to take it one step further, the business leadership job, the undersecretaries of management or administration, depending on what department you're in, I've been working back with like the Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee, or HISGAC, in the Senate to try to see if there was an evaluation to see how could you consolidate some of the business roles, because what you just said was a pure testimony of bringing in fresh ideas from the outside, political. In some mindsets, even politicals at the highest levels, we'll save this for cocktails, but they don't think the CFO should be confirmed. And when the story you've just told, you're bringing in corporate best practices. So in theory, you're not really implementing the policies per se. You're actually trying to make our taxpayer money more efficient. And so I think sometimes it's not understood. And I would just like to put a marker on the table. I definitely think that when an organization like HUD or DHS is going after big policy issues that are bigger than ICE and CBP, Secret Service, or Coast Guard, the heft of having a Senate-confirmed CFO that comes in and actually has relationships with legislators, has relationships at the top of OMB and potentially within the White House direct, and is a business advisor like you were for Secretary Carson. And I think that's the part where I struggle. Because I see the way it's designed to work, it actually is perfect. If you can get a Senate confirmed, they're a level 4 presidential Senate confirmed position versus a level 1 being a secretary, deputy number 2. So you get down. So when you get to level 4, there's not a focus per se, but I think it becomes its own problem. And then people look and they're like, well, they're a low priority, but if we were fully staffed at the right levels, this would work as planned.
My mind goes back and forth on that. Should the CFO role be Senate confirmed or not confirmed? And my mind goes back and forth. It should be a bipartisan role. It's fiscal responsibility. That should not drive a wedge between any discussion on that. You're protecting taxpayer funds.
There you go.
And you want to do it in a way that's creating fiscal discipline and without the fraud, waste, and abuse. That should just be nonpartisan. I do think every agency is structured differently. The DHS is larger, different business streams, if you will. HUD is, focused on one thing, but through different avenues. So why do I say that? The budget office, for example, sometimes agencies have their own budget office that report directly to the secretary or through the deputy secretary. At HUD, we had budget within the CFO. So you can drive policy through the budgetary process. And I sat on the budget, on our policy council, and was part of those discussions, and we became a champion of the policy through the budget. So that's really important. I also think if this was a career position, the CFO, I think you run the risk of having someone in that position for a long time and getting stale, which you so often see in any entity, whether it be private or public. Someone sitting in a role for a long time doesn't bring in those fresh thoughts and fresh thinking, and you start to become bureaucratic, right? So that slows things down. So also, if you want to attract strong talents, there's an appeal to being Senate confirmed.
I agree with that.
And it's a great resume build if you have other aspirations. So to me, it's a little bit tricky. I kind of like the fact that it's Senate confirmed because I like the bringing in, every so often someone new. I like the fact that you can attract strong talent with that. But I understand the argument, and I could go both ways with it, but I would tend to leave it the way it is.
Yeah, I've had a lot of different CFOs on the show, and a lot of them career, and their perspective of trying to get something over the line. It's helpful to have a political CFO that's connected to things to get stuff moving. The one thing that I would tell you that I thought, probably my biggest case for a CFO being political is it's in the details of resourcing policy.
Yes.
And some of the biggest items that I saw go through in my time at DHS would come back to the CFO shop. We would be trying to put together a story to go to Congress and then deal with the O&B evaluators. And I would say where we're at, and my deputy, Stacy Marcotte, we would be doing this together. Then it's handed off to the budget director. And that budget director career, they have clerk relationships on all sides. And, if there was just like one moment that person didn't agree with what you're doing, for me at DHS, I could lose $100 million in the fact. So if a secretary is sitting there by themselves and they look down, they say, make that happen, and then the word comes back, it didn't happen, you don't know where it broke down. But I think being a political CFO, you know exactly. And I think like you trying to figure out how can I do the best job I can? And one of it is, you're working for the person that was voted in, and they have an agenda that they're trying to, and a policy agenda. It's your job to be the detail person.
Yes.
And I think that was really, that was the light that it was like, because when you miss in the appropriation side or with O&B, you can miss by hundreds of millions of dollars.
Absolutely. And that's why George was so important to me, because George Tomczyk, my deputy CFO, because he had those relationships on the Hill. So I met with them quarterly, all four corners. I met with O&B quarterly, and I met with GAO quarterly. They were the three agencies that were most interested in us succeeding. And George's relationships were very powerful because, if something, we wanted to message something a little bit differently, and they don't necessarily always want to hear from the politicals. So George could call them and say, this is really why this is important. And I didn't have that credibility with them because I was a political versus a career. So it's very, very strong networking inside of DC. And you got to use those networks to message and to get to achieve what you're trying to achieve. In the communication, it's funny, we talk about that. I am fastidious about transparency and doing it in a simple way. And not all people are, but I'm big on just PowerPoint, say it simply and say it loudly and say it often. And one of the things that we did early on was talk about all of our deficiencies in the totality of them. And everyone said, no, you can't say that. You can't say that. And I said, well, we need to say because people really don't understand. And I said, but we're not just going to say, here are our issues. We're going to say, here is our path forward. And here are the resources I need. And here are the barriers to success. And one of the barriers inside of government is just getting funds to do what you want to do. We weren't going to fix this ourselves. We needed outside resources to help us. And I said, we can't say it once because they're not going to give it to us the first time. We've got to say it multiple times. We've got to be consistent with our messaging, and we got to be consistent with everyone we're talking to. And so we developed a standard deck that we educated everyone on in a very consistent way and constantly. And once they started to understand what the issues were in totality, what we were trying to accomplish, and that we had a vision. And then the vision included what resources were needed. That went a long way to get where we needed to go. And again, you know this, bringing that private sector mindset of communication, simple, often, and with conviction, and don't bring a problem without a solution. Bringing that to discipline to the agency was very helpful to get us where we needed to be.
So I got a question. So we get done with our time in the government, and you end up, you and I kind of part ways. We're doing different stuff. About a couple months into it, I was talking to you, and you're like, my book's coming out. Yeah. And if you wouldn't mind, you wrote an unbelievable book that was a little bit about your experience, but almost like a prescriptive form of what you learned and how to transform. Could you talk a little bit about your book?
Yeah, well, thank you for...
if you wouldn't mind, I'm just going to kind of put this up there, but the Transforming the Federal Agency.
So it's interesting. Long story short, we got ourselves into a clean opinion. We cleaned up all the material weaknesses, and we did things that people weren't expecting us to do. And we did it in a short amount of time. And as we were getting ready to wrap up, there was more I wanted to accomplish. And I was disappointed we didn't have a second 4 years at this, but that is what it is. And one of my partners at EY said, you ought to write a book about how you did this. This could be of value. So I had not written a book before. So I went to the secretary and I said, it was suggested that I write a book on how we went about this and how we accomplished. And he says, yeah, by all means, you should. And then my next question was, he's written several books. I said, what's the process? So he was very prescriptive with it. He said, well, what you do is just list out an agenda, what you want to talk about, what you want to accomplish, put sub-bullets underneath it, and then just write from that. So I took his advice, and I started it. As soon as the election was over, I knew I wanted to do this. So I started the process and talked a little bit about my background, what prepared me for this. I talked about the confirmation process. I talked about the book describes what HUD is and then what their issues were, and then very prescriptive of how we went through and attacked it. And, I think of it as, 8 cylinders. It starts with leadership. It starts with governance. It starts with a detailed plan. It starts with stakeholder buy-in, stakeholders being talked about the Accounting Resource Center that's set up by Treasury, how we interacted with them. I talked about the interaction with enterprise waste management, enterprise risk management, I should say, and then talked about IT modernization and robotics. So they were my 8 cylinders, and we just attacked each one of those. I talked about how we motivated the staff, how we took 10 years of a constant pattern of execution to thinking differently. I talked about the governance side of turning HUD around, and then I talked about our successes and how we celebrated successes. And then I talked about how to make it sustainable. And then I threw in a chapter at the end talking about how fun the job was and all the unique stuff you get to do. So
it was interesting. So a couple observations I had from the book. One, I remember contemplating, your 2 months of silence to the White House of whether you're trying to decide. And I know for me, trying to figure it out, wasn't a lot of resources for somebody that's business oriented to want to be able to go back and evaluate. One thing I would do is I looked at people that had CFO jobs across the government, and then I'd look at their LinkedIn profile and say, what type of experience do they have? And, how can they be effective? And so I think the one thing I think people would value in your book is that if you are sitting on it doesn't matter what party you are. If you look at this as like it's public service, you want to get the most out of it. You want to be the most effective you can. So I thought that it was very well covered in your book. The second thing I would tell you, and I'm going to take you down a couple of notches in a very figurative way, is that like I was the mayor for 12 years, and and on the city council, and in all municipalities across the United States, the city government structures in place, the city manager, at the county level, the county supervisors, and the state, obviously the legislation, but at all the levels of local, county, state, and federal, the education system, my show is Ameritocracy. So it talks about merit and it talks about the credentialing process to be able to kind of get to be at certain levels. And the thing that I got out of your book was in city government, being like if in Long Beach, California, for example, a big city, 600, 700,000 people, big budget, to be a city manager, most of these people have these masters in public administration. Yes. And to be able to even get qualified, in the government at the federal level, they have the SES process, they have the GS process, and each one has a rank and a credential required. So you kind of know where you're at. Then it really depends on, do you have the capability, but you definitely know the credential. Yeah. And I thought your book would be very popular. I've done a lot of guest lecturing and being a mayor is to try to provide a local view of how do you work with a full-time city manager, and then the city staff, planning, engineering, community development, police, and I thought your book would be helpful in master's programs or in the process of the master's in public administration. I was just kind of curious, do you find that you get a lot of feedback? I would think this would be something like you would be speaking in a lot of colleges and especially graduate students for people that want to get into public administration.
I do a lot of guest lecturing at Ohio State and Montclair. I graduated from Montclair and I sit on the advisory board for the business school. And I talk about a lot of this. And one thing I tried to get out of this book, I tried to do two things. I tried to inspire people to think about public service as part of their career path, if not all of their career path. I don't think colleges do a good enough job educating students on the value of executive branch experience. When you think of public service in colleges, it's on the legislative side, right? That's where the press is, that's where the action is. I wish I had this 4 years experience earlier in my career because I would have been a better audit partner. Educating, having this education of how budget works, how policy is made, the regulatory environment, how grants work. If I'd had this early in my career, I'd have been a better audit partner. So I tell students, don't dismiss thinking about the executive branch as a career path for 2 or 3 years or longer, because there's no industry you can't learn inside of government. They touch all of it, all of it. Housing, there's no part of housing you can't learn inside a HUD somewhere. Right. So I'm a big fan, and when I guest lecture, to talk about that don't dismiss it. And then also for folks like you and me, at the end of your career, if you want to give back, you can offer a lot more than public service to the executive branch. So I'm a big fan of that. So I tried to inspire that with the book. And the second thing I tried to inspire was, don't be afraid of financial transformation change. It's just really not that hard. If you just think about a couple of simple disciplines, and then it gets into the execution. Not to, it's not crazy simple, but it's not crazy hard either. You shouldn't be afraid of it. And I had talked to some folks that could take the applicability of this at the federal level, and state and local all have the same issues. IT modernization, financial stability, not a lot of business minds inside those entities. So the book could be very useful for that. It's exactly right.
So one of the things I wanted to kind of close with, I wanted to ask you kind of a perception question. So, before you came to DC, you kind of probably, I know I had a perception of kind of what I thought it would be. When I'm coming into DHS, the perception was not super favorable. Yeah. When I got into DHS, I realized, these professional people, and their heart is like, it's like the military. I mean, they look at it, public service and every day is the mission. And I found that to be unequivocally the way it was. But I think that the part that was kind of disheartening to me is, now I've been here for like 5+ years, and I go back and forth to California, but I remember being in there meeting with like Stacy Marcotte, who was my deputy CFO. And I would hear stories of people that were almost embarrassed to say they worked at DHS. Yeah. And then you see, as a person that's not so bought into DC, it's like, man, if America knew like all the great work here.
Absolutely.
And you would think you're in DC, like we're at the pinnacle if this is your thing, and it's been our thing. I love it. I wouldn't trade it for anything. But I think one of the reasons I did this podcast is I wanted to take some of those stories outside the Beltway because, if you're sitting here, I've done a ton of TV shows and radio and podcasts. And everybody loves it that's here in DC, and it doesn't get much play because it's all technical. It's all trade type stuff. And so I was just kind of curious at your view of evangelizing, and maybe your book was a little bit of a way to do this. Is like, how do you, how do we let the rest of America know that, like, that there are an unbelievable amount of dedicated people that work in the government that are actually doing great stuff?
Absolutely. I'm embarrassed to say, and I write about this, and I make this point in my book that I was surprised at the depth of talent and mission-driven people inside of government at all levels, whether it be political, but specifically at the career level. And I didn't come in with any form of arrogance because I didn't know the city, I didn't know the structure. I didn't know how it all operates. So I wanted to learn that. So I came with a sense of learning. But the quality of people at the career level and really trying to make a difference in America was very, very impressive. And I wish that was covered more. I wish it was covered more at the college level. I wish it was covered more at the press because it doesn't sell headlines. It's all the nonsense that gets to press. But if the American taxpayer knew how hard the infrastructure of the executive branch works for America, they would be pleased with their dollars. Now, there's plenty of waste, don't get me wrong, and there's plenty of ways you could restructure and save, but when it comes to the human capital side of it, these people are very strong and very good, and it made me feel good. And you probably sense the same thing. And at Ernst & Young, we work hard. It's a tough profession, especially pre-IT back in the 80s and 90s, you were working 80, 90, 100 hours a week to advance your career. Inside of the executive branch, when something goes wrong in America, these folks step up and work equally as hard. And a natural disaster, when the Puerto Rico natural disaster, people worked hard to make sure funds were getting to where they needed to be. And it's complex. People work very hard. The shutdown, the 31, 32-day shutdown, longest in history. People work very hard that were allowed to work to make sure checks were getting out to the people we serve. And I'm not talking, 9-hour days. I'm talking 12, 14, 15-hour days. And then when COVID happened, that was all hands on deck all over. So there were 3 times in our short tenure there that we worked really, really hard to make sure the mission was being completed. And it wasn't just politicals, it was career. I mean, it was really good to see. And I wish America had a sense of that because I think they'd be happy.
Well, I think we're trying to do our part, right? Just to kind of get that story out there. But
and I write about that. I mean, that is a point I make in the book, and it's an important point.
Yeah. Well, as always, really enjoyed spending the time with you. And, I definitely, it seems like you and I are on the road a lot. So we don't always get the amount of time that we like to have outside. But I really look forward to getting together and maybe getting a dinner here.
Well, thank you, Troy. I really did enjoy this. And it's always a pleasure to see you, as you know.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate being on the show.
Thanks.
Thanks again for joining me today on the Ameritocracy Show. Be sure to follow me on social media and our website at troyedgar.com, where you can get more information and sign up for my weekly email. I hope you have a great week.